Ilmar makes a supposed stunning claim and Democrats face growing pressure. So let's watch the video.
And uncertainty.
Our communities?
No, they blame Democrats because Democrats have been playing games with TSA and national security over the last 2 months. And it's all cynical political BS simply because the Democrats still cannot take the fact that they lost the 2024 presidential election. They do not want secure borders. They do not want interior enforcement of immigration, and the Democrats do not want to deport criminal illegal aliens. They want to protect them. The American people have never supported this type of position. That's why Donald Trump won the midterms. So whatever deal Mike Johnson and John Thune think they have, that's not with my vote. I'm not agreeing to that deal because we have a responsibility to fund all of ICE's operations and all of Customs and Border Patrol's operations. And let's be very clear, if you're not funding that, then you're not taking the security of the nation seriously. We already know that Democrats do not care about the security of this nation.
The admission. Something wasn't supposed to slip out that day. It was a routine town hall, a congresswoman, her constituents, a room full of people asking questions. Questions they expected would be answered with political talking points, rehearsed deflections, and the usual "we're working on it" language that politicians have mastered over decades. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was one of those rare moments in American politics where someone actually says the quiet part out loud, where the answer to a question that Washington has been dancing around for weeks gets dropped, plainly, directly, without spin, in front of a crowd in Spring Lake Park, Minnesota. And the moment it was said, everything changed. Not because it was a lie, but because it was the truth. And in today's political climate, the truth, especially when it comes to national security, has a way of cutting through every layer of noise and hitting people right where they live. So before we get into the reactions, the blame, the counter-arguments, the political maneuvering, let's start right there, at that town hall, with those words. Because once you hear what was actually said, you'll understand why the story you've been told about this DHS shutdown might not be the full picture. Mana, for anyone who hasn't been following this closely, here's what's been happening. The Department of Homeland Security, the agency responsible for border security, airport security, cyber defense, and coastal protection, has been operating under a partial funding crisis, not a full shutdown, but a targeted, deliberate funding block, one that has left thousands of federal workers in uncertainty and left critical national security operations stretched dangerously thin. The question everyone in Washington has been asking, at least publicly, is simple. Who is responsible for this? Republicans say Democrats. Democrats say Republicans. Leadership on both sides has been pointing fingers for weeks. And the American public, as usual, is left trying to sort through the noise and figure out what's actually going on.
Joey, so the allegation here that's been made is that Omar entered into a sham civil marriage with her alleged brother. That's the allegation here. Do you think Vice President Vance really believes that she committed immigration fraud, or do you think he's just playing to the base ahead of a 2028 presidential run?
I don't know. I mean, it seems like he believes it. I don't know what he knows that we don't know. Just the timeline here. So she came here as a child, like just to make sure everyone understands. She came here as a child, as a refugee. You can come as a refugee, and in about 5 years after that, you can apply for citizenship. And that's essentially what when she turned 17, she applied for it through her father, is what she says. So she has legal status in a pretty common way for refugees. It's not her legal status that is in question. It's did she help someone else gain citizenship fraudulently? I don't know the full timeline. Basically, she was married to someone, divorced that person, got married to someone else just long enough for them to become a citizen, then divorced that person. Or she was common law married to someone, lived with someone, then married this other person long enough for them to become a citizen, then broke that marriage up and married the person she was with to begin with. If you're in, a trailer park.
Representative Ilhan Omar sat down in front of her constituents, the people she represents in Minnesota's 5th Congressional District, and someone asked about the shutdown, about the DHS funding, about why the government can't seem to get its act together and fund the department responsible for keeping the country safe. And she answered it directly. She said Democrats are not going to pass the appropriations bill for the Department of Homeland Security unless specific changes are agreed to. 10 specific reforms. That's the number she gave. 10 demands that the Democratic caucus has put on the table as the price for their votes. Now, take a second and let that land, because what she described in that moment wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a negotiation breakdown. It wasn't bureaucratic gridlock or procedural delay. It was a deliberate decision, a calculated choice to withhold funding until certain conditions are met. Conditions that have already been rejected by both congressional Republicans and the White House. This isn't a rumor. This isn't a Republican attack ad. This is a sitting Congresswoman explaining to her own voters, in her own words, why her party is blocking the bill. Now, before anyone thinks this is just one-sided political commentary, let's be clear about something. Everything discussed here is drawn from publicly available statements, town hall recordings, and news coverage. This is analysis. It's not a declaration. The goal isn't to tell you what to think. The goal is to give you the full picture, the kind of breakdown that doesn't get enough airtime on either side of the aisle. You are free to form your own conclusions. You are free to disagree with any of it, but you need all the facts first. And right now, not everyone is getting all the facts. So what are these 10 reforms? What exactly is the Democratic caucus demanding in exchange for their votes? Omar touched on several of them at the town hall, but the one generating the most controversy and the most heat is the demand to unmask ICE agents. That's not a metaphor, that's literal. The demand is that immigration and customs enforcement agents should not be allowed to cover their faces when they're operating in local communities, when they're conducting patrols, when they're doing their jobs in neighborhoods across the country. Now, supporters of this demand will tell you it's about accountability, that federal agents operating in residential areas should be identifiable.
So denaturalization is very, very difficult. There's an exceptionally high burden of proof. So, I mean, what are the chances that this even happens?
It's not going to happen. And you know what? This is going to frustrate a lot of people out there. Let's be honest, though, about this. There is a protected class in this country. When you're the higher up the food chain you go, the less likely you ultimately would suffer the same consequences as, say, a regular person like us. So the truth is, I don't see this going anywhere, but I would say this. It's excellent politics because, again, I think maybe you mentioned it. It does feed the base, makes them say, yeah, go get him, JD, even though nothing will come of it. The threat of it's good. It makes for good copy. I just don't think there's a lot of there with respect to ultimate punishment, even if this were...
That there should be transparency in how enforcement is carried out. But critics, and there are a lot of them, will tell you something very different. They'll tell you that unmasking federal agents conducting immigration enforcement operations creates a direct safety risk. That agents whose faces are publicly visible become targets.
They do.
That their families become targets.
They do.
That this isn't reform, it's exposure.
Yeah.
And here's where the argument gets complicated, because both of those perspectives have a logic to them. But only one of them is the current basis for blocking the funding of an entire federal department. A department that, at this moment, is operating at reduced capacity, while the people who staff it are watching and waiting. Now, here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. These aren't just abstract policy debates happening in committee rooms. These are decisions being made by people who go home to secure neighborhoods, travel with security details, and will never personally feel the gap left by an underfunded TSA checkpoint or a stretched Coast Guard unit. That disconnect matters because when the people making the decisions don't feel the consequences of those decisions, the incentives get distorted. It becomes easier to hold a position, easier to dig in, easier to say, we're not moving until our conditions are met. When you're not the one standing at the airport gate, when you're not the one on the Coast Guard cutter, when you're not the one whose job it is to stop the next cyber attack with a budget that hasn't been approved. That's not a partisan point. That's just how power works. And it's worth naming clearly, regardless of which side of this you're on. Let's talk about what a partial shutdown actually means in practice. Because when politicians use that phrase, it tends to get abstract fast. Budget, appropriations, continuing resolution, eyes glaze over, people change the channel. So let's make it concrete. TSA agents, the people who stand at security checkpoints in every major airport in the United States. The ones checking your bags, running your carry-ons through scanners, making sure nothing gets on a plane that shouldn't be on a plane. Right now, during this funding standoff, those employees are working in an environment of financial uncertainty. The Coast Guard, the men and women patrolling American waters, coastlines, ports, international maritime boundaries, intercepting drug shipments, responding to emergencies, running interdiction operations, understaffed and underfunded during a period when the threat environment is elevated. Cybersecurity personnel, the analysts and specialists inside DHS responsible for protecting the country's digital infrastructure. Power grids, water systems, financial networks, government databases. These are the people standing between everyday Americans and some of the most sophisticated state-sponsored hacking operations in the world, and they are being affected by this. Omar herself acknowledged all of this at the town hall. She didn't pretend the shutdown has no consequences. She described the impact clearly. TSA, Coast Guard, cybersecurity, all affected. And then she said something that should have triggered wall-to-wall coverage. She acknowledged that this shutdown is happening at a moment when the country's terror alarm is higher than usual. Read that again. Higher than usual. A sitting congresswoman confirmed that the United States is operating under an elevated terror threat, and in the same breath explained that her party is blocking the funding bill for the department designed to respond to exactly that threat because their conditions haven't been met. That is not a small thing. That's not a talking point. That's a direct acknowledgement of the tension.
Omar just admitted they shut it down because we Republicans would not give them money to give these foreigners who don't belong over here. You gotta understand, when they do a government shutdown, it's not because they do it for the good of people. No, they're doing it because they want the Republicans to kiss their ass and hand over money to give these fucking foreigners who do not belong here in the United States of America. That is money that can be used to help the American people here. They want to give that money to these foreigners from Venezuela, from Somalia, which, to be honest, Somalia over there, Minnesota, California, Illinois, and all those submarines stole a lot of money. Federal money that's coming out of my paycheck, y'all paycheck, everybody's paycheck, we pay taxes. Federal taxes out of the paycheck. Been stolen and given to those foreigner bastards. And they talking about, oh, they're the victims. They're being prosecuted. No, motherfucker. You stole hard-earned money that's coming out of my check, out of y'all's check. They have to sometimes get up 8, 12, 24-hour shifts just to have money. Well, you got people like Omar sitting, driving Rolls Royces and BMWs and Cadillac Converters and everything, no problem. Sipping champagne, smoking Cuban cigars, eating Wagyu steaks, eating caviar, dancing that way in fucking 300-400 down, $1,000 dresses, nothing over that. They wipe them out on $100 bills, nothing. But we American people, having our hard-earned money sucked out of our checks, handed to these four fucking parasites. Back to the video.
Of this entire standoff, and it came from one of the members of the caucus holding it up. Let's sit with that for a moment, because this is the part of the story that tends to get buried under all the political noise. When a terror threat level is elevated, what does that actually mean for ordinary people? It means intelligence agencies are tracking something. It means the threat assessment has moved. It means the people whose job it is to connect dots are connecting dots. And what they're seeing is concerning enough to raise the alarm. And in that environment, the agency designed to respond is running on fumes. Not because of an attack, not because of a natural disaster, but because two sides of a political argument can't agree on 10 reforms. That's the situation. That's what's actually happening. And every day it continues is another day the margin for error gets a little thinner. Now you might be wondering, where are the Republicans in all of this? What's their response? Enter Byron Donalds. The Florida congressman has been one of the loudest voices on the Republican side throughout this standoff, and his response to Omar's town hall was exactly what you'd expect from someone who doesn't use diplomatic language when blunt language is available. He called it cynical political BS. Not reform, not negotiation, not a policy difference, cynical political BS. Donald's argument is straightforward. He believes that what Democrats are doing, withholding DHS funding over demands related to ICE enforcement, isn't really about reform. He argues it's about something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with the 10 demands on paper and everything to do with what happened in November 2024. His position is that Democrats are still processing the results of the last presidential election, that the American voters sent a clear message about what they wanted on border security and immigration enforcement, and that rather than accept that mandate, a portion of the Democratic caucus is using the appropriations process as a pressure valve, as a way to fight the last election through through the current legislative calendar. Whether you agree with that characterization or not, it's a serious argument because the question it raises is real. At what point does policy disagreement become obstruction? And when does obstruction of national security funding cross a line that both parties should be unwilling to cross, regardless of who's in the White House? Donald's made one other thing very clear during his public statements. He doesn't care what a deal looks like on the surface. He's not going to vote for any agreement that doesn't fully fund ICE and Customs and border protection, full stop. No partial funding, no creative accounting, no continuing resolution that kicks the problem 6 months down the road. If ICE and CBP are not funded, his words, you are not taking the security of the nation seriously. That's a direct challenge to his own party's leadership, by the way. Mike Johnson, John Thune. Donald's made it explicit that whatever leadership negotiates, he's not a guaranteed yes vote if the final product doesn't meet that bar, which tells you something about the pressure on both sides of this thing, because it's not just Democrats versus Republicans. There are fault lines within the Republican caucus too. Members who are more willing to deal and members who have drawn lines they say they won't cross. And this is where something important needs to be said. Because what we're watching right now isn't just a budget fight, it's a stress test. A stress test of whether the American political system, as it currently operates, is actually capable of protecting the country when protecting the country requires two sides to agree. And the answer, based on what we're seeing, is not encouraging. When one side says we'll only vote yes if our conditions are met, and the other side says we won't negotiate on security, the country doesn't win. The country waits. And while it waits, the threats don't pause. The actors who wish this country harm, they don't take breaks for congressional recesses. They don't wait for appropriations bills to get resolved. They move when the moment is right. And right now, the moment looks increasingly right because the people responsible for stopping them are caught in the middle of a political standoff that has nothing to do with them. Now, here's something that most people covering this story have completely missed. And this is where it gets interesting. Think about the position both sides have put themselves in. Democrats are saying, fund us on our terms, or we won't vote yes. Republicans are saying, we won't negotiate on security. And meanwhile, the department actually responsible for security is sitting in the middle of this, underfunded, understaffed, and waiting. There's a word for what happens when two sides dig into their positions so hard that the actual mission gets forgotten. That word is dysfunction. And right now, dysfunction has consequences. Real ones. Not hypothetical, not theoretical. Real people, real airports, real coastlines, real threats. The political fight is happening in Washington, but the effects are happening everywhere else. And that gap between where the argument is being had and where the consequences are being felt, that gap is widening every single day this drags on. Let's go back to Minnesota for a moment. Because Omar didn't just talk about the national picture at that town hall. She got specific about her own state, and the numbers she shared are striking. She said that CBP and ICE agent presence in Minnesota has dropped from nearly 4,000 agents to less than 400, a reduction of over 90%. And then she went further. She said that even 400 is still too high, that the normal level, in her view, should be somewhere between 150 and 200 agents. Now, that's a statement that's going to land very differently, depending on where you're sitting. If you believe in aggressive interior enforcement, that number sounds like a deliberate reduction of federal law enforcement capacity to a level that couldn't meaningfully respond to any significant situation. If you believe federal immigration enforcement has been overextended, those same numbers probably sound like a call for a more proportionate approach. But here's the thing. Whatever your view is on the right number, this is now on the record. A congresswoman who is part of the caucus blocking DHS funding has stated publicly what she believes the optimal level of federal enforcement in her state should be. That is relevant information. Not because it's scandalous, but because it tells you something about the values driving the demands, about what the 10 reforms are actually aimed at achieving in practice. There's also something else in Omar's statement worth paying attention to. She mentioned ongoing concerns about the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. She called for independent investigations. She framed this as a